Hello and welcome to another episode of Righteous Judgment. In today's video, we're going to be talking about this guy, the atheist voice. Now, there are two types of atheists out there. Ones that I can have a kind of respectful conversation with, who are actually being pretty reasonable. And then there are people like this, who are complete idiots. And excuse me calling him an idiot, but you're going to see why in a second here. So this is a video he made. It's called 20 Short Arguments Against God's Existence. So we're talking about the existence of God and whether he's real or not. So let's watch this video and respond to some of his arguments.
There's no evidence.
All right. First argument. There's no evidence is his argument. Actually, there is some pretty good evidence that God does exist. Roll clip.
That we have two options here. Either the universe is the uncaused first cause, or something beyond the universe is the uncaused first cause. The problem is that all the evidence points to the fact that the universe is not the uncaused first cause. And I didn't have time to go through that evidence tonight. That was part one. But I'll give it to you very briefly in an acronym, SURGE, S-U-R-G-E. S stands for the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the universe is running down. Well, if it's running down, somebody must have wound it up. We'd have no energy left right now if the universe was eternal. The U stands for the fact that the universe is expanding. Edwin Hubble detected that back in 1929 and shows that everything came from a single point, a point actually of infinite density, the singularity, which is actually nothing. So the universe had a beginning. The R in SURGE stands for the radiation afterglow. That's the remnant heat discovered by Penzias and Wilson in 1965, which is literally the smoking gun to the Big Bang. There's heat, remnant heat from the Big Bang still out there, which shows that the universe had a beginning. The G in SURGE stands for the great galaxy seeds, which were very fine temperature variations in that radiation afterglow that allowed the galaxies to form in the early universe. And the E stands for Einstein's theory of general relativity, which shows that time, space, and matter are correlative, that they came into existence together, that space, time, and matter literally had a beginning. Einstein knew this in 1916. Then observational evidence began in 1919 when Eddington did his test on the eclipse. And then Hubble discovered the expanding universe in 1929, and then on to the radiation afterglow and the great galaxy seeds after that. So the evidence points to the fact that the universe is not the uncaused first cause. So there must be something beyond the universe that is, and that thing that's beyond the universe must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. And if you're timeless, do you have a beginning?
No.
No. So God is not, he didn't have a beginning. He's the uncaused first cause.
God doesn't stop the evil in the world. In fact, if you read the Bible, God committed plenty of it.
Okay. Number two is that God doesn't stop evil but commits evil in the Bible, okay? I don't know why he's bringing the Bible into this. And this is something I see a lot of atheists do. They try to prove that God doesn't exist by things the Bible says or the things God doesn't do, but that doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. That may prove that you don't like the God of the Bible. It may prove that maybe the God of the Bible isn't real, but that has nothing to do with God's existence. Because even if God turns out to be this malicious, horrible person who just kills people, that doesn't mean he doesn't exist. Lame argument. Next one.
Drowning just about everything alive? Not a sign of love.
Again, he's bringing up the Bible. The drowning people, just because God is evil would not mean that he does not exist. Now, do I think God's an evil person? No. I believe there's good explanations to why God has done things. But that is not what we're trying to figure out in this video. If you want to make a video about 20 reasons why you don't like the God of the Bible and think he's evil, well then make a video like that. But don't just start quoting random Bible stuff or weird random points if they're not actual arguments that prove God doesn't exist. Because all you're doing is just showing that, hey, maybe God's evil, but it doesn't prove that God doesn't exist.
The opening lines of the Bible are factually wrong. Why should we believe the rest of it?
Again, bring up the Bible. See my former point.
Prayer has never fixed anything physically impossible. Why won't God heal amputees?
Again, referring back to all this prayer stuff. Nothing to do with God's existence. This has to do with the Bible.
There are thousands of gods you don't believe in. What makes yours any different?
That has nothing to do with God's existence.
Where you're born essentially determines what you believe. Why should the truth be based on geography?
Again, that has nothing to do with God's existence. Who cares what you believe? You can believe whatever you want, but it doesn't change whether God exists or whether he doesn't.
Who created God? And how does your answer to that make any sense?
Finally, something we can talk about, which technically we already did talk about with question number 1, because he goes ahead and already explains that how all the evidence points to a spaceless, timeless, materialist being that exists, and if he's timeless, he can't have a beginning. So, continuing on.
Pediatric cancer.
Again, just because there are diseases does not affect whether God exists or doesn't exist.
Unconditional love shouldn't come with a list of conditions.
Again, this has nothing to do with God's existence.
Every single supposed miracle gets debunked eventually.
Nothing to do with God's existence.
Somehow, the 10 Commandments left off, don't rape people, and slavery's not okay.
Again, has nothing to do with God's existence.
The movies and music that honor God are just awful.
Again, this doesn't prove God doesn't exist, but actually not all Christian music is crappy. There's some good stuff out there. Try listening to like For Today, or NF has some pretty cool sounding songs. I mean, I understand there's a lot of crappy stuff out there, but still. We're on the subject of God's existence. Doesn't prove that God doesn't exist.
The invisible and the non-existent look very much alike.
Doesn't prove that God doesn't exist.
No hide-and-seek game lasts this long.
Doesn't prove that God doesn't exist.
Science explains so much of what we used to attribute to a God. The
That doesn't prove that God doesn't exist.
more we learn, the less reason we have to believe in God.
Doesn't prove that God doesn't exist.
If you try to explain your religious mythology to someone who had never heard it before, you would sound crazy.
Doesn't prove that God doesn't exist.
Seriously, try explaining communion wafers to someone who's never heard of Catholicism. If God didn't exist, the world would look exactly the same way it does now.
That doesn't prove that God doesn't exist.
If God existed, he would smite me right now. I'm good.
Again, all these points this guy goes through, it's nothing but a bunch of baloney. None of these arguments even come close to trying to prove that God doesn't exist. I'll respect 2 of them, which was question number 1. I guess I'll respect. I think it was question 8 or 9, where he asked who created God. But a lot of these are more arguments against the God of the Bible, not actually God's existence. And whenever I talk to atheists, I always make sure to make a separation. Hey, we're just talking about God's existence here. Once we understand that God exists, and you see all the evidence for that, then we can go on to the God of the Bible and all the other events and why rape isn't mentioned in the 10 Commandments, etc., etc. But I think the evidence for God's existence is substantial, and I also think there are plenty of resources for a lot of those questions you have. Just do a Google search of a question that you have, like why isn't rape mentioned in the 10 Commandments? And then just scroll through. There are tons of responses to these questions where they explain them all in great detail, which every time I get a question from an atheist where they've got their little, question that they're going to get you with, which I know a few of the answers to a lot of the questions they ask because I get asked some of the same ones over and over. But it's all a matter of if you're a truth seeker or not. If you are really wanting to know if the Bible's true or not, seek it out for yourself. Start studying. Take a look at both sides of the argument. I think it's painfully clear that the Bible is reliable, that God is a good God, and that you should worship him. Thank you for watching today's episode of Righteous Judgment, and we'll see you guys in the next one.